Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So today, obviously, the fighting continues. The war between Russia and Ukraine continues. There is continued discussion about the destabilization efforts by the Russians against the Ukrainian defensive position. So, as the Ukrainians fall back from areas such as Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and other areas along the front line, the Russians then proceed to focus on these new defensive positions that the Ukrainians are trying to set up. We have seen continued use of very heavy glide bombs, 1-ton glide bombs that are continuing to attack Ukrainian positions. We have also had reports by the Russians of successful strikes against Patriot air defense systems and other Western air defense systems that were recently moved closer to the front line to try and prevent these Russian glide bomb attacks against Ukrainian forces. Now, we continue to see Ukrainian raids in the Belgorod region. These raids have not amounted to any taking of territory. Again, these are nuisance raids designed to create a false narrative. Again, designed to create some semblance that the Ukrainians are having some sort of success, much like the attacks on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. While the Ukrainians were able to position forces, small numbers of forces, company-sized and maybe even battalion-sized elements in some of these swampy areas on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, they have not been able to deploy additional forces, additional heavy equipment to take advantage of this perceived bridgehead. And a bridgehead is not what it is. Hence, the Russians are essentially leaving it alone and attacking it with indirect fires and occasional probing attack with special operations forces. Now, what's interesting is some of the information that we're now hearing because of these Ukrainian attacks that have taken place in Belgorod. We are now hearing that the Russians could be creating a contingency plan and or a actual legitimate plan for the complete occupation of Ukraine if and when the Ukrainian army collapses. So the Russians continue offensive operations, and we believe right now the Russians are preparing for very large-scale offensive operations in late summer. The Russians believe it's possible between now and late summer that they could see a general collapse of the Ukrainian front line, causing massive Russian breakthroughs and capture of large amounts of territory. At the same time, ongoing Russian strikes against infrastructure and other targets throughout Ukraine is wearing the morale of the Ukrainian people thin. And in conjunction with the collapse of that morale and the Ukrainian fighting capability could lead to the Russians believing that they would have the ability to occupy the entire nation. And given what is happening within the attacks with Belgorod, the continued discussion about the war effort continuing by the Ukrainians until the Crimean Peninsula is liberated, is forcing the Russians to have a close look at what entity in terms of Ukraine the Russians can deal with post-war. And it is in some way believed that the Russians believe that they can not deal with any Ukrainian entity that is sympathetic to possibly joining NATO. Thus, the complete occupation of all of Ukraine. Now, that would entail the deployment of some 500,000 Russian troops with an additional 100,000 National Guard and other federalized police forces that would need to be used to occupy all of Ukraine, all the way including areas such as Odessa and Lviv itself. So that is just one option. Obviously, there are other options and other contingency plans. But given what is happening, and given the fact that the Russians are looking 10, 20 years into the future about what this Ukrainian entity could look like, and if in fact it could be a threat to the Russian Federation, they're thinking to themselves, well, we just take it all. We take it all. We control it all. We control Ukraine. We control Belarus. And we prevent any more NATO expansion. Any. Realistically, if we had an end to the war, and depending on how much additional territory the Russians take, that area that is still under Ukrainian control, sympathetic to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, would undoubtedly become a proxy of NATO. It may not join NATO, but it would have the military capabilities of NATO. NATO forces would probably be at some point deployed in what is left of Ukraine. Then obviously Ukrainian forces would be propped up with Western armaments such as F-16s and HIMARS and other systems that the Russians fear would reconstitute a legitimate threat to Russia. And again, you have to understand the Russian perception and the Russian experience of World War II. Here in the United States, we weren't invaded by the Germans. We weren't invaded by the Japanese. At no point outside of some small Alaskan islands did the United States have to engage hostile forces on its own territory. Okay? The Germans were about to enter Moscow. They were about to enter Moscow. And again, back to the Russian perception, if there is a hostile entity east of the Dnieper River, or now even west of the Dnieper River, the Russians simply don't want to deal with it. And at this point, whereas at the beginning of the conflict, I think there was some discussion within Russian circles about how much of the Ukraine would Russia take. And I got to say, at this point, the Russians have to be asking themselves, given the support by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, if the opportunity arises, okay, if the Russians find themselves with the capability of seizing control of all of Ukraine because the Ukrainian army just falls apart, would they do it? And I think at this point, the answer is they would, if the opportunity were to arise. Now, are the Russians there yet? Do they have that capability to take control of all of Ukraine? Has that opportunity arisen? It has not. But that's not to say within the next several months, and especially going into late summer, and how large-scale Russian offensive operations evolve and whether or not they are successful, again, we could see the general collapse of the Ukrainian military and the seizure of large amounts of additional territory, which would then beg to ask the question, could the Ukrainians prevent a all-out Russian offensive with the objective, as they continue to expand both their military-industrial capacity and the size of their armed forces. Again, what does the Russian military look like a year from now? What does it look like in late summer? What does it look like 2 years from now? Obviously, it's going to be much bigger than what it is now. The Russians are committing lots of treasure to the building of its armed forces, which are going to be much larger and much more capable than what we observed in terms of Russian capability in 2020, 2021. So we anticipate we will continue to see Russian offensive operations. We will continue to see the Russian use of airstrikes and very large amounts of glide bombs and strategic ballistic missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles to degrade and destroy the Russian military. The Ukrainian military, while the Russian proverbial god of war, its artillery, continues to cause just massive amounts of casualties to the Ukrainian forces. And this is what's, again, decreasing the morale of Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian casualty rates are at an all-time high, especially with the deployment of these larger glide munitions guided by Russian, essentially GPS GLONASS satellites that are hitting very precisely these Ukrainian targets. And the Russians have become more successful in going after and striking some of these Western air defense systems that were deployed closer to the line of contact as well. So that's where we sit for today. We will continue to watch. We will continue to report. Obviously, thank you for joining us. More to come very, very soon as always. Have a good day.